Okay, I say we are officially a quorum, and I say we're going to get started pretty much now. Okay, so first of all, welcome to everybody. Welcome back to many of you. As always, I'm going to start with some thanks. I want to thank everybody who has contributed to help support the costs of this series and of the endangered alphabets in general. I want to thank Alec Julian, who is running the production from behind the scenes, and also Patricia Julian, final name not entirely a coincidence, who composed the amazing theme music that you heard as you came on and will play again at the end. Patricia is a composer and teacher of composition here in Burlington, and also a flute player and a professor, and just working with her to compose music that goes with endangered alphabets. Interesting challenge, and I'm super grateful to her for doing such a wonderful job. Okay, so some of you were here last time, some of you weren't, so I'm going to just bring up two themes that are running through this series and that, that got brought up last time, going to continue today. So the first of those themes is that now the endangered alphabets is really about global social justice as expressed in writing systems. But at the beginning, when I first started, it was about writing. And so today, as last time, a lot of my thoughts and ideas that I'm going to be offering you in the spirit of non-expertise discovery are really about writing. And the second point that is going to run through all of these is that after working on the endangered alphabets for 10 years, and in particular, having started it not as a linguist, but as a carver, I have come to think of writing as something much more interesting, more ambitious, and richer than just a series of symbols created or intended to represent the sounds of speech. And so today's session is obviously very, very much about that, because I'm not just talking about writing as used in a spiritual context. I'm going to be talking about the fact that writing as a spiritual endeavor in itself, which is really kind of out there, and I'm going to need to lead you through how all of this came about. So I'm going to start in my usual fashion. Those of you who saw last week have already seen this walkabout. Those of you who weren't here last time get to see the interior of the world headquarters of the endangered alphabets for the first time. And there's a couple of things in particular that I want to show you. So as we get up and move around and we see these various pieces of wood with carvings in them, one of the things I want to show you, and we'll come back to this in a minute, this is a Balinese character called a Pamada, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And we're going to continue with this Balinese theme. We're wandering around. We're also going to look at Mandaic again, and have some more thoughts about that. And we're also going to talk very much about this. So this was one of the carvings that I did in the first exhibition of endangered alphabets. This was Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Balinese. It took me a year to find somebody who could send me that script. So as I wander back to my sitting place and camera one, I want to show you that particular piece of carving in an earlier stage. In fact, I'm going to show you the piece of paper from which that piece of carving emerged. So Alec, if we could cut to the first slide, I'm going to go and resume my position over by camera 1. Right, so this is the story behind this particular image here. The way that I get a piece of text onto the wood to carve it is that somebody sends me the text, because I don't read or write any of these scripts. And I print it out at Kinko's at a size that works for this particular piece of wood. And then I use carbon paper. And so what you see here is the original printout. You can't see the carbon paper under it, but underneath that is the piece of wood. So what happened here was that I was really excited, because I had already really come to love the Balinese script, but it had taken me, as I say, a year to find somebody who could send me this translation. And when I'm transferring with the carbon, I just use a cheap, ordinary ballpoint pen. So I'm going over these letters kind of firmly, trying to stay within the lines. And mostly what happens is what you see toward the right-hand side of this slide, which is it's a black printout, and then I'm going over it in blue ballpoint pen, so it starts turning blue. But on this occasion, it was around the middle of the day, and I was living in a house that was right next to the house next door. It's very, very close. And all of a sudden, the sun came out from behind one of the chimneys of the house next door, and it fell on the text that I had been, kind of converting using a ballpoint pen. And somehow, something about ballpoint pen ink meant that the sunlight reflected off it, not blue, but gold. And I was stunned. And as I sat there, and we're pretty much where you are now, looking down at this writing, a whole series of things came to me one at a time. And I'll go through these, because in many respects, this is what launched my entire thinking about the spiritual nature of writing. So the first thing that struck me was the word illuminated. So I had thought of illuminated manuscripts. I thought that word really just kind of meant decorated or painted or ornamented. But here is something that you see that looks like an illuminated manuscript with all of the use of gold leaf, but it's illuminated by the sun. It has its own form of illumination. And I started thinking about this notion of illumination, or to use a different word meaning exactly the same thing, enlightenment. And we're going to come back to this notion of illumination or enlightenment in a minute. But I was sort of staggered by the thought that the word illuminated meant taking the light and embodying the writing with that light so that someone else can see the light and become illuminated in their turn. So a few other things occurred to me right around the same time. The next was, as I'm looking at this, it suddenly struck me that the posture that I was sitting in as I was working on this was the posture that would also have been used by a medieval monk or a scribe who was illuminating a manuscript. This sense of leaning forward, head down, working on this text in front of you. And I thought, that's really interesting, because in a sense, both are acts of devotion. So the monk who is doing the copying, or I guess technically the scribe who is doing the copying, is really bringing all of his powers of concentration and devotion to that work. And I was doing exactly the same thing. And then it occurred to me that when we write, especially when we are trying to do our best writing, and of course you have to realize I'm coming to this whole project as a writer, what we do is an act of focus and concentration. We are bringing the same sense of devotion and pulling together from our own mind, our own spirit, our own soul, call it what you like, that the monk is doing. And that in turn led to this really extraordinary notion of the relationship between the immaterial and the material. By the way, little side note here, I've noticed some of you are already using the chat, the text chat. Please, please feel free to do this as I'm talking, either to bring up ideas, that we want to talk about later, or bring up ideas that we can talk about when this whole thing is over by text, or bringing up questions as well. So please feel free to use that. Anyhow, so what I was thinking is Shakespeare says that the lunatic, the lover, the poet are of imagination all compact, which means several different things. Compact right there, the compacting of the imagination. And he says that the lunatic in particular, he gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And I thought, what an extraordinary notion that as writers, or as lunatics, or as lovers, we're taking something immaterial, something imaginary, something that is a thought, an idea, and by writing it, we are introducing it into a material world. We may be writing it on paper, we may be carving it on buffalo horn. There's all kinds of things we may be doing, but we're creating something that has substance that somebody else can see. And not only that, but we're doing it so that this physical manifestation can then have an immaterial effect. It can affect the way somebody else thinks or even acts. And I thought, this is really an interesting notion, because that parallels the concept that in the beginning was the word, that the act of creation is an act of thought. It's an act of divine thought where someone, a divinity, has an idea and makes it manifest, makes it physical, makes it visible to everybody. And I thought, this is really, really interesting. But I had no idea how interesting it was, or how closely connected it was, in fact, to Balinese, which is where all this had started. I had no idea about this for about another 10 years. In fact, until about a month ago. This is how live all this is. And in fact, speaking of live, one of the people in the group today, Olish, told me today about a spiritual script that I had never even heard of. And I'm encouraging him to write this up. And we're going to put it up on our social media, and we'll find a place in the atlas to put it. That was this morning. He was up like in the morning Poland time sending this stuff to me. That's how live all this is. Anyhow, back to Balinese. So what I'd like, Alec, can you put up the next slide, please? So this slide is of a Balinese lontar. And lontar refers to the palm tree, whose leaves are used for this kind of writing. And as you can see, the writing is not only beautiful, but also extremely delicate and specific. And then the palm leaves are bound together within these wooden slats. And we look at this and we think, oh yeah, that's you know, kind of a skillful use of a local materials and local technology to create something. But probably part of us is thinking, yeah, it's kind of primitive. And the fact is that, and I've said this before, I would not have thought about writing in the way that I do if I hadn't stepped outside of the beliefs that we have about writing. So let's find out a little bit more about what is really going on when somebody does an act of writing in Bali. So Alec, if we could move on to the next slide here. So this is a section from this extraordinary book or essay, series of essays on Indonesian writing. And this is specifically about Balinese. Belief in the divine origin and the supernatural potency of writing has also produced a web of rituals that surround literate activity, including writing, reading, discarding lontar texts, storing lontar texts, and paying homage to the goddess Saraswati, the patroness of literature, knowledge, and eloquence. Now, we don't think in these terms because for us, writing is so functional. I'll take a piece of paper, I'll make a grocery list. But what I'm encouraging you to think about is, what is writing actually doing? And what do we want it to do beyond just make a grocery list that we may not have considered before? So here we are in a culture that recognizes the power and the possibilities of writing and treats it accordingly. So again, I'll go back to the quote. For example, mantra must be recited. So we're talking about, by mantra, we essentially mean prayers or blessings, right? Must be recited when carrying out the following activities: writing, requesting a boon to write. This is someone's asked you to write for them. Crossing out consonants. This must first be recited over the tip of the stylus. Crossing out vowels. So notice there's different mantra for those two different activities. The mute symbol and numbers. Opening exalted writings. So think about this. This is an exalted writing. This is a book of immense importance. Wouldn't it make sense to be aware of and mindful of that presence before opening it? The opposite would be to write or to act in writing or to read writing without any reflection. And of course, that's Twitter. And we know what kind of trouble that gets you into if you chuck writing out there without thinking about it, without considering consequences. Okay, so closing and storing lontar, absorbing knowledge quickly, burning lontar. This is so interesting. Damaged lontar cannot be just thrown away, but must be cremated like the human body. And adorning consonants with vowels. Failing to recite these mantra, in other words, failing to recognize the full meaning and respect of the act of writing or reading, is said to result in dire consequences. A short lifespan results should the letter named Secek be crossed out. Blindness and headache are the consequences of crossing out the letter Hulu, which means head. Lameness arises should the letter Suku, which means foot and leg, be crossed out. Deafness and stomach ailments following the crossing of the letter Talang, because Talinga means ear. So, speaking of respect, lontar need to be stored in wooden chests, woven baskets, or cupboards, which in turn need to be in a sacred space within the house, according to the principles of geomancy. On the day dedicated to the goddess Saraswati, which takes place once a year, 210 a year, the entire day is scripted by ritual. During that day, nothing written may be destroyed, or even a letter crossed out for fear of punishment by the goddess Durga and malevolent spirits. All the lontar and household are gathered, and they act as the representation of the goddess, right? So they're acting as a representation of wisdom, but also the relationships between people and the divine. To whom 18 offerings are made, one for each of the letters of the Balinese alphabet. Each offering contains the symbol of the supreme god made of fried, not friend, rice dough. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a glimpse of a culture, and I believe this happens not only in Bali, but elsewhere in Indonesia as well, a culture that has an extraordinarily profound sense of the meaning and value and importance of writing, and for whom writing has not yet been trivialized. And in fact, can we move on to the next slide? In fact, they even have a character that we don't have and we don't even really understand. So this character is called a Pamada. You saw the carving of it a little earlier. And this is a character that is placed at the beginning of a sacred text. And so it really has multiple functions. It reminds the reader, hey, this is a sacred text. Take it in accordingly. Act towards it with an open heart and respect. It also acts as a relationship between the divine and the text itself, a gateway, so to speak. So it isn't even a letter. I guess we don't even have a word for what it is. I suppose it's a kind of punctuation. It's a signpost. It is the text speaking to us and saying, behave in a certain way, be a certain person, be the best person you can be at this moment. So in that sense, writing in general takes on this notion of the invitation of the possibility of being the best person you can be, because in writing, you have the possibility of affecting anyone else who can read it. And we don't really stop and think about that at all. Okay, so I want to go back to this notion of illumination and the idea that writing in itself is it's an illuminated form of passing on illumination or enlightenment. And I want to talk about the Mandaeans. So the Mandaeans have possibly the most exquisite awareness of the importance of writing in the material and immaterial worlds, which they see as being indivisible. So here's a quote from, that's the Mandaean carving we looked at before. One of the interesting features of Mandaean, by the way, is that it is justified on both sides, even if it's handwritten. But here's a quote that I want to read you about Mandaic. Okay, so in Mandaic, each individual letter has its own mystical meaning. Moreover, the alphabet consists of the 22 separate functional letters of the Aramaic alphabet. So these are the letters that actually, get pronounced. But then adds on another 2 letters to make the total up to 24, the number of hours from sunset to sunset, and therefore a mystical number. One of the added letters is a ligature of 2 characters, something like an ampersand in English, which, as you know, is like an E and a T put together, meaning et in Latin, or and, right? The final letter is simply the first letter repeated to give the impression that the alphabet is not linear and finite, but like the day, repeats on this, 24 cycle. In a sense, instead of being linear, it's circular. It's like a mandala of an alphabet. It's an alphabet that turns with the earth. Just, again, a wonderful notion. So a remarkable English woman called Lady Elizabeth Drower, her husband was a diplomat stationed in the general area of Mesopotamia, where the Mandaeans were living early in the 20th century. And she extraordinarily not only managed to make contact with the Mandaeans and be accepted into their society in general, but also invited into their spiritual and mystical ceremonies. So the Mandaeans are Gnostics. You may well know that the word Gnostic means a person of knowledge, from the Greek gnosis. So Mandaea is from the Mandaean word manda, which means knowledge. We are people of knowledge. And knowledge here doesn't mean knowledge of facts. It means knowledge of the divine. It means comprehension. It means enlightenment in that sense. So she writes, Lady Elizabeth Drow writes the 1,012 questions. And the 1,012 questions tells us that each letter of the alphabet emanated from the last, which is like Athena being born out of the head of Zeus, right? Starting with the circular A, the wellspring Anya, from which all the other letters emerged, letter B, and from the letter B to letter G, and so forth, until 23 came into existence. Each praised and worshipped its predecessor until they formed a new kind of structure, a wall spreading out to the left and right from the L, the middle letter, because the L is the builder's clay, or legna, that holds the left wing and the right wing of the wall together. Unfortunately, this wall stood only for itself. In other words, it was linear and could not support anything else because the right and the left stood apart from one another. They soon realized that if they were to clasp their hands together and form four corners joining back to the letter A, they could build a solid foundation. Again, becomes circular rather than linear. Thus, A became both the wellspring from which they emerged and the crown atop their heads. Only then did it become possible to name all things and speak every mystery, because language is not possible without, look at this phrase, this indivisible republic of letters. Isn't that just amazing? This indivisible republic of letters shows us how much we take writing for granted and fail to give it its due. The Mandaic alphabet invites us to think of writing as a miraculous transaction, analogous to the act of creation itself. In creating the physical universe, according to many traditions, the creator took a thought, something invisible and insubstantial, and made it visible, solid, habitable. Likewise, the act of writing takes an invisible, substantial thought and makes it visible. The point then is not that Mandaic writing is a vehicle for transmitting information that can lead to enlightenment. It is that each word, each letter is in itself charged and radiant with enlightenment. We're getting a little bit of background noise. You may want to mute yourselves if there's stuff going on in the background. Just a thought. Okay, so as if that weren't amazing enough, I'm going to move on to some other alphabets that are inextricably connected between culture, spiritual belief, and the writing system. So the Cham people, let's move on to a slide of the Cham, or not the Cham alphabet, but just one of the Cham letters. So this is the letter E in Cham, about which I will have more to say when we talk about the art of writing. So the Cham people, there were once a kingdom in central, what we think of as Vietnam, were defeated by the king of Vietnam in the mid-19th century. But their writing system is so important to them and their spiritual beliefs that it's actually part of their pre-cremation ritual after death. If we can move on to this quote slide next. The script's importance goes so deep in Cham culture that among some Eastern Cham, learning this script is a rite of passage in funerary ceremonies. Don't try and say that quickly. As a part of a 4-day cremation ceremony, one of the rituals is, and this is if the person who's died has died not knowing his or her letters, not being able to read and write. One of the rituals that a priest will perform is to kneel down and teach the deceased how to read and write Cham. Only after the human spirit has acquired skills in reading and writing may they become cremated and pass on to the afterlife. I mean, this is really amazing stuff. So the next one I want to talk to you about is So the Sora people are a fairly numerous minority in eastern India, in, I believe, Jharkhand and Andhra Pradesh. And the majority of Sora have their own language, and they use one of the neighboring scripts. But there is a subgroup of Sora who are known as the alphabet worshippers. And this is a coaster that I carved as a Kickstarter premium, actually. This is part of the Sora Sompeng alphabet. And this is a unique alphabet. It's an inspired alphabet, like many that came to somebody in a dream or a religious dream or trance. And let's move on to the quote. So the relationship between the Sora and their script is extraordinary and possibly unique. And so this is from a book called Living Without the Dead by Piers Vitebsky. In the 1970s, they held what may be the most elaborate form of communication between the living and the dead documented anywhere on Earth. Almost every day in every village, living people engaged in conversations with the dead, who would speak one after another through the mouth of a shaman in a trance. Together, living and dead would chat, weep, or argue for hours at a time. This transcendental use of language was carried over into their script. According to tradition, on June the 18th, 1936, a Sora named Malia received a dream showing him where to find a special Sora script magically inscribed on a mountaintop. So this is not all that uncommon. We know of at least half a dozen scripts that were sort of demanded or dictated in a dream, but not merely inscribed in a rock, say, but actually embodied in the spirit landscape. In Malia's dream, each of the 24 sonams, or resident spirits, because this is an animist religion, who populated and made up the Sora spirit world, changed into a letter that began the sonam's name. So if the sonam's name began with B, then in this dream, the territory that was inhabited or manifested by that sonam would be the letter for B. So we're really talking about a spirit alphabet landscape. That's all I think we need from that particular quote. So what we're seeing then is that many other people and cultures are not only using writing for spiritual purposes, they're understanding writing in spiritual terms. Yeah, can we move on to the next slide? So here, this is actually from Siddham. So this is a Buddhist script, and this is a carving that actually I did for a Shingon priest. And this particular letter is actually a syllable. It's the syllable sa, and you see it rising out of the lotus. And again, the notion that writing actually manifests out of the natural world is really kind of interesting. And in Shingon Buddhism, the individual syllables of the alphabet are used as meditation tools. So once again, there's this notion of focus, of devotion, of bringing all of one's mind and self together, is used not only for meditation, but for healing. I want to go to the second paragraph here, and this is what the priest himself told me. Kaji, which is their syllabary, has healing qualities. In both ancient and modern times, Kaji healing has been performed to assist a person who is ill. A Shingon priest opens the state of Kaji for healing by performing a specific ritual within the main ritual. The healing ritual involves prayers for the well-being of the ill person and use of specially prepared water, while including the sick person in his or her awareness. the priest sprinkles a drop of water on this ill person's head. But it's the focus of the syllable that creates that state of concentration and awareness. And so there are specific mantra or prayers that focus on specific syllables for specific purposes. Okay, so that led me to start thinking about shamanistic writing systems. And there are a number of those in China, minority systems that are extremely old. And we're going to show you a slide now with a couple of these on. On the left, this is the Nashi Dongba script. On the right, this is the Sui people have a script called Shui Shu, which, as you can see, is an interesting combination of characters that are similar to standard Han Chinese kanji characters and other characters which are completely different. Now, a conventional view of these writing systems, which were used only by priests and were taught only to acolytes who are learning to be priests, is that because these symbols don't correspond to individual sounds, they're not really writing. They are, so to speak, a series of memos for rituals. So, for example, you know, next you do the this particular recitation, and we're going to show that by a mnemonic. So this particular character on the left here means you genuflect in this direction, or this particular character here means then you use this invocation. And it's just a kind of, as I say, a mnemonic or an aide-memoire. And yet, I wonder about that. I wonder if once again we're doing what I talked about last time, which is bringing a modern conception of writing and assuming that people a long time ago thought that way. I wonder, in fact, whether in putting these characters and making them visible, the ceremony was not, in fact, bringing the power and the intent of that spiritual entity into being in the writing. And I don't have anything about either of these scripts that actually says whether this is or is not the case. But luckily, we're going to show you one last slide where we can see something like this. I'm sorry, two last slides. Yes. So these are firmas, or signatures is how it translates. And they derive from Congolese symbol systems, but they've been developed in Cuba. And as you can see, they're extremely complex. They're non-linear. So one of the things I love about this system is that the whole notion that writing is something that we do in a straight line and you read it from one end to the other, busted wide open. These are expressions of a complex cosmology. I'm looking at this thinking, I have absolutely no idea what this means. But of course, that may be the point. I'm an outsider. I may not be supposed to know what this means. So luckily, Barbaro Martinez Ruiz does know what these mean. Here's a second slide with sort of individual symbols, and these can be built together into something which looks like a map or a diagram, but isn't. And what it actually is going to be on our very last slide coming up right now, because Barbaro writes about this. Firmas are used to depict and call forth spiritual forces, communicate with ancestral spirits, and facilitate divination. The signatures function as a type of map or electrical circuit, whereby the electricity and force of God, like the cosmic vibrations manifested through religious objects, circulate and materialize. Signatures are used to convey feelings, intentions, and desires. So it's not just that it's coming in, it's also going out to spiritual forces and serve as a means for a practitioner to visualize and communicate with the powers of the spirits. Like a text that conveys Holy Scripture, signatures enable both aesthetic and conceptual understandings of religious values. Signatures are also used to energize people with the forces summoned by the signature, right? So the signature is not just a depiction of the force. The signature is a kind of a gateway or portal through which the force can be manifest. When the people supplement the motion of the firma through dance and gesture, the result is a graphic in motion that becomes a perfect symbol of God as a unifying and active spirit. Similarly, firmas are used for healing and meditation and for the facilitation of mutual transactions of energy between priests, practitioners, and God, or the forces relevant to a particular religious experience. Firmas are also used to teach practitioners religious values and to provide instruction in the organization of time and the sequencing of ritual components within the religious ceremony, which is a heck of a lot more than just a mnemonic or an aide-memoire. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to say a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to unashamedly do a pitch to say to you, we really hope that if you found this of interest and value, you'll make some kind of contribution to support the continuation of the work of the Endangered Alphabets. And Alec will put the link up on a slide at the end. Very, very easy, do it through PayPal, or we will not accept sacrifices of calves, bulls, or anything else along those lines. Secondly, I would love to hear your questions and comments, because this is where I learn all kinds of stuff from you. If you use the hand up button on the participant tabs, then you can say, hey, I want to ask a question. But as I say, if it's looking as if there's a whole lot of stuff going on and we're running out of time, please feel free to use the chat function as well. Comments, questions, complaints, abuse, ritual, ceremonial phrases, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm now throwing the floor open to anyone who would like to suggest and contribute in any way. Okay. I'm getting a stunned silence.
I'll kick it off.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
You've talked about writing as a spiritual act, and that there are some languages that are alphabets that are only written in a religious or spiritual context, and they're usually or oftentimes written in gold paint or maybe even gold leaf. And I was just wondering if you could name a number of specific ones where that might be the case, or talk a little bit.
Right. So I'm going to do what I always do when somebody asks me a question that I can't answer, is to answer a different question that I can. So
Okay.
after this is all over, I will do some research for you and send you some. But one of the things that I realized when I looked at that Balinese illuminated piece of carbon text that I was doing is that when we write in black or in a dark color, the letter is defined by its edge. So when I'm carving something that's where the writing is going to be black, I'm really, really paying a lot of attention to the edge, because that's really what defines the letter. And in fact, as our writing technologies get more and more sophisticated, they are ways in which they become ways in which the edge is more and more defined. So printing out something on a laser printer so that you can blow it up many, many times is a perfect example of a technology that pays attention to the definition of the edge of the letter. Gold is different because gold, when you're painting in gold, the letter is not defined by the edge, which is actually much less distinct. It's defined by the heart. So the goldness is at its most vivid and reflective where the paint is most concentrated, or the gold leaf is most concentrated, which is in the well of the letter. And so that's one of the reasons why a letter painted in gold seems to radiate. So not surprisingly then, when we're looking for a kind of writing that implies illumination, we would want to use gold because the letter itself is radiating and illuminating just because of the nature of the light that's being that's working with the letter for us to see it. But yes, I'll look up some examples of scripts that typically use gold, and I will email them on to you. Next question.
As per usual, I'll have something to say. It was very informative, and it's very interesting. And there are some things which are, first, of course, now you see the similarity between firmas and the Chinese talisman writing.
Yes.
They are non-linear. They're communications with the other side. And what is more interesting in Chinese talismans, they are to be destroyed, which again brings Tibetan mandalas and sand writing and columns and all that sort of communication, which again, the Saussurean definition of writing is the record of the language. When in this kind of writing, it's not record of the language, it's a record of thoughts, record of what we call mentalies. There's really the definition of writing we have is not.
Yes, our definition of writing is way too narrow. The other thing that you're talking about also is the element of performance. So there are a number of kinds of writing where the act of performing is part of, is at the heart of everything, and the act of doing the writing is part of the performance. And so that means that instead of writing being a static thing, which is a record, a lasting element that's all about containing information, it means that it's actually part of a relationship and discussion and convergence of people and of forces. So that's a great observation. Okay, somebody else.
I put a question in the chat, Tim.
Okay, yes. Let me go down to chat. Oops, for some reason, I'm not getting my chat. Oh, okay, here we go. Is this through your research? Have you also learned things about any spiritual underpinnings, etc.? Is this Danielle?
Yes, yes, this is.
Oh, great. Spiritual underpinnings of any writing instrument, quills, pen, yes. So this is really interesting. So in Indonesian culture, there are several different media that have been used over the past, well, minimum 500 years, quite possibly 1,000 years. One of them is bone or horn. So there might be a jawbone of a buffalo, might be buffalo horn. One of them is palm leaves. One of them is bark. So you have these folded bark books, which are really, really interesting. And they are used for different purposes. And actually, I was having this conversation with one of my researchers from Indonesia, literally 2 days ago. And I said, can you find out whether there was a connection or criterion, really, about which of these media you used for which particular purpose? And that research is going on right now as we speak. I don't know There are clearly many cultures where the only people who wrote were shamans or priests, and so therefore, by definition, the writing instruments would have been connected with that kind of spiritual power or authority. What I don't know is whether that's also true in cultures where writing is used for sacred purposes, but also everyday secular purposes. So that's a great question, and I will find out an answer for you. And if I can't find out an answer, I will make one up.
Thank you, Tim. That was great.
Okay, next. Gary, you had your hand up a minute ago, but now you don't. Does that mean I've answered your question, or you've decided I'm unlikely to be able to answer your question because I know so little?
I don't know. I think I thought about it and didn't really know how to form my question. But one of the questions I have, I guess, is, does any of this occur in the Americas?
Yes, but before I get onto that, so you said I don't really know how to form my question. One of the things that's been occurring to me as I've been researching and writing about this stuff just in the last few days is I've been looking at the standard definition that Olish was talking about and that I've been talking about writing. Now it's really way too narrow. And I started thinking about the question, how do we use writing to convey that which cannot be put into words? And it seems to me that a number of writing systems that are not strictly speaking writing by our definition, but nevertheless use a symbol system in order to communicate. One of the things that's going on really is they are trying to find a way of extending the phonetic system to include things that cannot be put into words in that system. And actually, we do exactly the same thing. So one of the really interesting things that has happened since the rise of the internet and the widespreadness of personal computing and phones is the way in which we have started using writing in ways that previously were not possible or were not respectable. So, for example, one of the first things that happened when people started getting computers was that the range of fonts that was available became much, much greater. And so all of a sudden, you could start using fonts, but also the color to express what you wanted to say on a kind of an emotional level. And then, of course, the second thing that happened was the rise of emojis. And so now we actually have in Unicode, I mean, the fastest growing elements of Unicode is emojis. It's people who want to be able to convey an emotional state without struggling to put it into words. So in that sense, this whole question of, how do I say what I want to say, as soon as we move into a broader or more intentional or more emotional or more spiritual aspiration of what we want to say, the more likely we are to go beyond the conventional alphabet. So in the Americas, yes. So one of the 3 or 4 supposed birthplaces of writing is Mesoamerica. The pre-Mayan scripts, the Mayan scripts, post-Mayan scripts, and many of those we don't really know what they were for because they haven't been adequately translated or deciphered. But fairly clearly, they were not mundane. Some of them seem to have been histories. Some of them seem to have religious and spiritual purposes. Likewise, in North America, it starting as early as the 17th century, a series of missionaries adopted the Micmac symbol system and sort of organized it and converted it, is a good word, I suppose, as a means of teaching Christianity and therefore also of conveying spiritual values. So those are the only ones I know, but I would absolutely bet there are others. And now, of course, you're making me realize that's more research I need to do before I send my draft of the next version of the Atlas to the editor in 2 weeks' time. So you just made my next 2 weeks infinitely harder.
But you're locked down, so you have plenty of time.
Yeah, believe me, if I made a list of all the things I'm supposed to be writing in these next, actually by June the 22nd, that editor is going to get something that is bulging at the seams. Okay, thanks.
Can I make it more hard?
Yes, please do, Olish.
No, because it's really interesting what you're writing, and the polite writing, whatever it is like 19th century.
Yeah.
If you look at the 18th century, 17th century, the European mostly intellectuals, especially I'm talking about Kircher, and he's trying to understand what was Egyptian hieroglyph, and them coming up with the ideas of emblemas and writing things like Biblia Pauperum, which were combined of pictures more than writing, but they were supposed to be more understandable for common folk. It's really interesting, but it's a whole another book of research.
Yes,
like
and
emblemas. It's very, very interesting.
Yes, and interestingly enough, I have been writing stuff just in the last couple of days about this Darwinian theory that grew out of that in the mid-19th century, well, actually 1860s, 1870s, where you have the birth of anthropology. And the early anthropologists, who were, of course, English and American and really colonial thinkers. Yes, and German, were really colonial thinkers. They're the ones who put out this theory that the most primitive forms of writing were pictographic. And the assumption is these people, they're so primitive, they're so childish, they can't do anything other than draw pictures. And then out of pictograms emerge ideograms and then syllabaries. And finally, you emerge at the phonetic alphabet where one syllable equates to one sound. And that has this kind of ascetic perfection. And of course, that is a totally colonial and racist view. Because as soon as we, in our early 21st century sophistication, get the chance to incorporate ideograms and pictograms in our writing, we do so all over the place.
Yes, yes, exactly. Like Darwinism in writing and social sciences, beware.
Exactly. Yes, yes. And of course, I'm going to put that in my book, and that's probably going to make a lot of people really upset. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Who else wants to jump in here and cause trouble?
Keith has had a couple of interesting comments in there. I don't know if he's
wanting
to talk, but
okay, Keith, do you want to talk, or do you want me to read this out loud? Keith, you are muted.
Oh, hi there. Sorry.
Hi.
That was pretty much all I had to say on the subject. But if you'd like to expound further on it, I'd certainly be interested in hearing your thoughts on them.
Right. Okay. So looking at Keith's chat comment, Micmac hieroglyphics likely originated in traditions similar to the Ojibwe Wigwas Bakun. Is that right?
Pretty much Wigwas.
Okay. Thank you. Which is a continuous tradition of inscribing characters on birch bark scrolls. Yeah, birch bark, very important in Canada, and the northern tier of what is now the United States. Proto-writing meant to assist a storyteller in remembering details about the story. There are also scrolls for explicitly spiritual use called, can you pronounce that one for me?
That's Mandaic.
Got it. Which contains sacred teachings only transmitted among members of, oops, I'm sorry, my cursor is over the top here. Right, the Medicine Lodge. Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the same media, namely birch bark and presumably scratching or soot or some other writing medium, were used for both secular and sacred purposes?
Definitely sacred. I know the stories themselves, I guess you could kind of consider a lot of them within the realm of the sacred as well. Yeah, and,
right.
And it seems that this writing system or pictographic system emerged specifically as some sort of spiritual purpose.
And that also goes back to my notion, and also the things behind me here, of the relationship between wood and trees and writing, which has always been a very, kind of intimate relationship. Yes. So James Evans, who created or co-created the syllabics for the Cree, his nickname was the man who made birch trees talk. So he was also using that as a convenient. Not sure how we would ever know this, if in using birch bark within Cree community, whether there was any prior Cree association between writing on birch bark and their own traditional storytelling and sort of spiritual ceremonial qualities. And that was kind of part of the background to the writing that he was then teaching to them, and they were then teaching to each other. Really, really interesting. Okay, we are out of time, I'm afraid. But yes, if you've put questions in chat, I've got your email addresses. I will jump on that and send you such information as I have, poor though I am. And as you know, I knew nothing about this when I started, and I've been learning about it by carving it. So maybe this says something about the relationship between wood and writing and learning, or maybe it's just that I didn't carve stone because it was too heavy. When I did my first exhibition, some stonemasons said, "This is great, you should do it in stone." I said, I had to drag a steamer trunk that weighed 140 pounds into this building just to put up this exhibition. I dread to think what I would do if I did this on stone. Anyway, again, thank you all so much for joining us and for your comments and questions. Alec is going to put up the slide with the link. As always, we have information for you there. We have the bid to support us. And there's also a link to the Atlas of Endangered Alphabets at endangeredalphabets.net, which contains pretty much everything that we know on this subject so far, although that is growing by the day. So thanks again. We're going to end the broadcast here. This will be available in recorded version. I will send out the link as soon as it's ready. And the next talk will be on Wednesday, and I believe the next one is the art. Yes, writing and human rights, social justice, endangered alphabets, all of the above. Thanks again. See you soon. Bye-bye.